I'm Sarah Williamson, and this is Going Long with FCLT Global. On this show, you'll learn what it means to be long-term from the top minds in global business and investing. Leaders from companies and investment organizations join us to discuss how they are leading their teams for the long run on issues including capital allocation, risk management, climate change, and sustainability. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org. Today we're joined by Alan Jope, Chief Executive Officer of Unilever, one of the world's leading consumer goods companies. Alan joined Unilever in the UK in 1985, subsequently working in North America for 14 years and in Asia for 13 years. Prior to being appointed as Chief Executive Officer, Alan served as President of Unilever's beauty and personal care business from 2014. So, Alan, Unilever has recently updated its vision to be the global leader in sustainable business and its purpose to make sustainable living commonplace. How do you translate that vision and that purpose into running the business every day?
Okay, Sarah, that's a big question. A little bit it comes from the stories, the DNA, the living history of the company. 140 years ago, our slightly crazy founder, a guy called William Lever, defined the mission of the soap company that he had founded as to make cleanliness commonplace and lessen the load for women. So way back in the late 1800s, he was on a mission to contribute to public health, and he was on a mission to, I guess he was an early feminist. Now, fast forward, and we define our purpose as to make sustainable living commonplace, and our vision is to be the global leader in sustainable business. And I want to make it clear that we don't have a business strategy and a sustainability strategy. They're fully integrated. And to answer your question directly of how do you translate it into practice, well, we have the same theory of change on all the big issues that we're tackling. The first, which is think about 4 concentric circles. And the innermost is getting our own house in order. So let's use gender as an example. 8 years ago, we did not have very good representation of women in management. We now have 51% of the 14,000 managers in Unilever are women. And that's getting your own house in order. And that's true whether it's for gender representation or our carbon footprint or impact on nature. The second ring is to use our value chain. So the suppliers that supply Unilever and the distributors that distribute our goods. And again, if you stick with the gender example, we find, surprise, surprise, lots of the smallholder farmers who supply agricultural products to Unilever are women, and they're subjected to terrible gender-based violence, actually. So we take care of that. And many of our micro distributors in places like India are women, and we create economic opportunities for women through that extended value chain. Then the third ring of the circle, probably where we have the biggest impact in society, is through our brands. And the reach that our brands have gives them a tremendous impact. And sticking again with gender, Dove as a brand is the biggest brand in Unilever and has been on a mission for 2 decades now to help young girls on the unrealistic beauty ideals that are portrayed by the beauty industry. And so we've taken action, one-on-one instruction with 60 million girls around the world over that time period, not to mention the reach of our broader based brand communication. And the final ring of the circle is our advocacy, where we're working with governments and regulators and influencers to try and create regulation and rules that support the directions that we're taking in the business. So almost every change that we're involved in, we think about it and get our own house in order. How can we leverage our extended value chain? What impact can our brands have? And what's the role for advocacy?
That makes a lot of sense, and that really allows people across the company to have a common framework for how does this filter out. So that's really helpful. Similarly, you are clearly a leader in this idea of multi-stakeholder capitalism. You talk a lot about the various stakeholders. I mean, you just talked about some of them in your value chain or in your brands and so on. And how do you approach meeting the needs of so many stakeholders that you have at Unilever? And can you give us some examples of those? You've mentioned a couple already.
So our approach is based on a belief that stakeholders are interdependent. It is not one versus the other. There is ultimately an alignment of interest. Although there is a sequence, we believe that when we take care of our employees, they'll take care of our business, our consumers and our customers, our business partners. And in doing that, that gives us the scope to take care of the societies where we do business and our planetary impact. And when we do all of that well, our shareholders will be better rewarded as an outcome. Now, of course, at any point in time in the short term, we do have to make choices and prioritize our resources. So not everybody may get what they want all the time. And our managers do have to make priority calls. But over time, we find that our stakeholder interests align. And let me give a couple of examples. If I wanted to maximize the short-term profit delivery of Unilever, it would be very easy. We could have a 1 or 2 fabulous years if we underinvested in training or in safety, or we under-advertised our brands, or we undercapitalized our factories. Those are examples where it'd be dead easy to, frankly, virtually double the profitability of Unilever. But not a single member of that value chain wants that. In fact, one of the surprises I had coming into the role was just how many of our investors were saying, Alan, don't worry too much about the quarters. Please run the business for the long term. And I think that's where you see the convergence. If you take we made a commitment recently around paying everyone in our value chain a fair living wage. We discovered a few years ago that not everybody in Unilever in our direct payroll made a fair living wage. Now, this is more than minimum wage. Fair living wage is enough money to feed, clothe, educate, and house yourself and your family. We set about a few years ago making sure that everyone in Unilever was paid at least a fair living wage. We recently, just last year, said that within 10 years, everybody in our value chain, everyone who supplies or distributes Unilever's goods will pay a fair living wage, or they won't be doing business with Unilever. And there's no altruism in that. A fair living wage creates stronger societies that will buy more shampoo and more mayonnaise and more toothpaste, more laundry detergent. So it's enlightened self-interest, and there's many examples of that. The way we're tackling the future of work. Unfortunately, one of the things as consumer patterns change, demand patterns change, unfortunately, we do have to close factories from time to time. And literally the most recent one that we've shut was making laundry detergent in Italy in a place called Pozzuoli. It's not a very economically strong part of Italy. And we had to shut the factory. But we found a partner who was prepared to co-invest with us. And we actually repurposed the factory to become a recycling center that would collect and recycle plastic. And we're now able to source plastic into our other sites in Europe, high quality recycled material. And I won't bore you with all the commercial details, but the payback on the investment to repurpose that site was very attractive versus paying large numbers of redundancy payments. A very topical example. We are encouraging everyone in Unilever to get vaccinated against COVID. We're even looking at procuring millions of doses of vaccine when it's available. We don't want to jump the queue, so we want to do it ethically. It's expensive stuff if you're talking about buying a couple million doses. But again, the business case is absolutely elementary. So we think ultimately doing the right thing typically has a strong business proposition that sits behind it.
Well, one thing I think that you have talked about and Unilever has demonstrated is that you've thought about investing in sustainability, like some of the examples you've just given, just like investing in your brand, or people would invest in technology or in R&D or anything else, versus this this trade-off mindset. I know you said your managers have to make decisions, of course, prioritizations, but rather than this shareholder versus stakeholder or one group versus another, the trade-off, how do we as FCLT Global and as a community get more people to think in the investment mindset? Because then you can make investment decisions that are logical. I want to invest in, repurposing this plant, for example, is something that a good investor, a good capital allocator, a good business person can actually analyze and think about, rather than sort of this vague trade-off mindset. How do we shift the conversation?
Well, I think this is the single most important question that we're going to discuss here, Sarah. It is absolutely corrosive to think of investing in sustainability as a trade-off with strong financial performance. I'm sure we'll come on to talk about it in a second, but this is a question very close to my heart. The world is facing multiple simultaneous crises, and people are not blind to it. We've got obviously a health crisis with COVID, but actually that's a tiddler compared with climate change or the loss of nature or growing inequality. Those are the really big ones. And people are expecting businesses to do something about it, to be responsible, to be sustainable. The data is screaming at us from consumers, but also from employees. We're finding investors are increasingly scrutinizing these drivers. They're asking very direct questions about how sustainability drives stronger performance. And regulators and legislators are increasingly recognizing that the transition to a sustainable economy is essential for long-term healthy growth. If you look at in Europe, the new Green Deal, if you look at the current administration in the United States, very quickly committing to protect 30% of the country, the nature that covers 30% of the country, stepping up on carbon commitments. And we think that, businesses that don't align with these drivers will either become unattractive as brand choices of consumers, they'll become unattractive as employers, they'll become unattractive to investors as the costs materialize, and they'll get regulated out of business. So if you take, high certainty scenarios, we think it's generally accepted that there will be a price on carbon sooner or later. So reducing your carbon footprint makes straightforward economic sense. And this multi-stakeholder long-term model, we believe, does help to align the business against these realities that are coming at us like a freight train.
So do you try to bake that into, for example, a carbon price on an investment decision today, to try to sort of look forward, take your best guess? You may not be exactly right, but your best guess, and put that into sort of every investment decision you make when you choose, project A or project B. How do you actually operationalize that?
So we do for capital decisions. We don't for OPEX. So we don't, for instance, in how we spend our advertising dollar, but we do every capital project in Unilever has an internal carbon price. It's currently $50 a ton, which is probably a little bit low. And that goes into a central pot that we use to invest in experimentation, new types of energy systems in the business. Some of the fun things we're doing on plastics is funded by our internal carbon tax. We've saved about €1 billion in the last 5 years from a very early commitment that we made to go to green electricity, which has turned out to be cheaper than fossil fuel derived electricity. And again, that's created space for us to do other things in the business. So yes, we have an internal price on carbon, and the sooner there's an external price on carbon, the better, as far as we're concerned.
It's interesting that you're actually taxing people, because I've heard of a number of companies who build that into the model, but it's not quite real, right? It's more theoretical. So that's really interesting. So how much do you think you need to be able to measure the investments in sustainability versus sort of taking the leap and then figuring out along the way? Because I think one of the challenges that's facing leaders today is perhaps they've made commitments that are a long time in the future. They've gotten themselves to make that commitment, but the path from here to there is a little foggy. So how do you kind of, how do you bridge that?
Well, it is certainly true that we should all be suspicious of anyone who claims to have a crystal ball in the future. I think we've all learned just how uncertain that is. But equally, we will not slay this trade-off mindset unless there's a strong business case. And we think the business case, certainly in our sector, is emerging very, very clearly. It's got 4 components to it. The first is growth. The brands that have embraced sustainability in their consumer proposition, and I could give many, many examples, are growing twice as fast as the rest of the portfolio. And Kantar did a study over a 12-year period and found that brands with a strong purpose grew 175% faster than the rest of their portfolio. The rest of the markets that they surveyed. So we think there's a strong and emerging growth case. The second is it absolutely reduces costs. So I already mentioned the savings on energy, but the savings that we've also made on water consumption, on material reductions, on waste, getting less waste in the system, is another 1.2 billion euros. And kind of the logic is, I guess, if you're consuming less resources, it should cost you less money. The third part of the business case is less risk. And I think there's a macro element to this and a micro element to this. The macro element would be, adverse weather events are a very real thing for us right now. We will sell less this month because of the climatic change that's happened in Europe at the early parts of this summer. Australia, in fact, you could go through almost every country in the world. And adverse weather is a bad thing for Unilever's business, but there's also micro risk. We didn't get it right on Black Lives Matter last year. We stubbed our toe big time on a couple of brands. Tresemme in South Africa managed to put up on one of our customers' websites a picture of Caucasian hair and labeled it normal hair, and a picture of Afro hair and labeled it dry and frizzy hair. Now, can you imagine the blind spot, the size of the blind spot in our company that could result in something like that happening? But because we've done so much high integrity work elsewhere, the Black community in South Africa came running to support us when we really upset some people, but we got tremendous support, including, by the way, from the president of the country. So I think doing the right thing does reduce risk, macro risk and micro risk. And then the final point is it's an absolute magnet for talent. So if growing faster, reducing cost and reducing risk isn't enough, how about the simple argument that people want to join companies that are run according to values that align with their own values? We have graduate recruitment programs in 54 countries around the world. We used to be the employer of choice in our sector in 17 of those countries. We're now the employer of choice in 52 out of 54. And we've seen extraordinary increases in engagement in our employees. And it's not just entry level. We find it easier to attract board members to non-execs. We find it easier to attract senior executives. So put all that together, growth, cost, risk, and talent. And I think there's a pretty decent business case for taking a long-term, sustainable, multi-stakeholder view. It's starting to emerge.
I think it's clearly starting to emerge. There's a little bit, sometimes people look at Unilever and think, wow, they're so far ahead. What do I do with my little company to get there? But I think that that's a framework that could be, translated to almost any industry. You mentioned a few minutes ago that your shareholders, many of them told you, manage this company for the long term. Did they understand that argument that you just made, and how do you think about the investment community broadly? There are probably some that do, some that don't. How do you figure out which is which and who you want to talk to about these issues.
Yep. Sarah, let me react to the first thing you said, though, in the question, which is I still feel Unilever is underperforming our potential. Until we double our growth rate, I don't think we will have proven conclusively that we are modeling the case for long-term sustainable multi-stakeholder business. And that is my determined commitment and my executive team's determined commitment that there's still trapped potential in our fabulous business. And let's see if we can unlock that in the coming quarters and years. Now, having said that, I am happy to report that I've literally I still consider myself a rookie CEO. And 2 years ago, we would have a meeting with an investing firm, and there would typically be a kind of junior member of staff who would get 5 minutes at the end of the hour to ask ESG questions. And truly that has completely stopped. And now some of the toughest grillings I get from our highest quality investors are, is it really true that your brands with purpose are growing? Can you show me more information on what you're doing about climate change? How are you going to honor your commitments on responsible sourcing? These have become very mainstream discussions with portfolio managers and chief investment officers. And that's why I began with the statements that I did, which is we have to make this connection between sustainability and business performance. Unilever is not an NGO. And the more we recognize that, the more we seem to be able to have very positive conversations with our investors, most of whom have got a shorter time span than the owners of the assets that they're managing on behalf of. As you know from your work, a lot savers have got on average, what is it, a 13-year duration on their time horizon. We are very happy with our long-term investors who take a 3, 4, 5-year view. But I think we all need to keep moving in that direction.
Yeah, it's one of those classic problems that we look at all the time, which is that time frame mismatch between a very long-term saver who perhaps is saving for retirement or whatever it may be, and a very long-term company like yours, but the decisions that are being made are the ones in the middle. So that is having that sort of multiple horizon outlook and being able to explain that is critical. So if we think about some of the commitments you have made, you have committed to be net zero emission by 2039, which is a unusual year. So I first of all wanted to ask you why 2039, maybe, and how do you find that is driving your behavior? Again, is it the commitment driving the behavior? Is it which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the commitment or is it the culture that, has been there for, as you said, since your founder?
We do believe that audacious goals set the right intention. So I don't think it is chicken and egg. I think you have to begin with audacious goals. There's an incredibly sophisticated logic to 2039 and our commitment to being net zero by 2039, which is we just wanted to get it done before 2040. We wanted to get it done in the 2030s sometime. But it's not the whole story. We'll be net zero in our operations by 2030. So it only takes that extra 9 years when you factor in all the way from raw materials to the shelf. So kind of scope 3 emissions. I think long-term goals, what they do is they push us beyond incrementalism. So you've got to think about departures from your current technologies and approaches if you're going to achieve these very different stretching type of goals. But what matters more than the goal is the plan between now and then and the measurement systems to track how you're performing. Now, in November of last year, we were the first company to voluntarily commit that we would put our climate transition plan in front of shareholders. And we did it for a number of reasons. We thought, first of all, it would be a good discipline to write the plan rather than just shout the commitment. Secondly, frankly, I wanted a mandate from our shareholders to get busy with that plan. And thirdly, we thought the plan would benefit from the dialogue that would ensue. And I think that's been true. I think we've really benefited from discussion with not just investors, but other interested stakeholders who have given it a close look, our climate transition action plan. So we put it to shareholder vote in early May. It squeaked through with 99.56% shareholder support. And although I say that with a twinkle in my eye, it is interesting the kind of magnitude of shareholder support that we got for the ambitions that we've set and the plans that we've built to get there. And it's quite useful having that tucked in our belts as we move towards COP26 this year. I hope at COP26 we'll see two things happen. We will see government raising their ambition. That's already happening. But I hope that whole sectors will unite to add the private sector voice at scale to decarbonizing the economy, decarbonizing the world, so that we get back on track, or we get on track for no more than 1.5 degrees of warming versus pre-industrial levels. And we're mobilizing, for example, the Consumer Goods Forum to get all the companies in the consumer goods sector to try and put together an aggregate commitment. And if the same would happen for automotive and energy and various chemicals industry, I think that would be a wonderful achievement coming out of COP26.
That industry by industry approach makes sense both for the companies, but also the investors. As you know, many investors compare companies like, within an industry, compare one company in an industry to another.
Actually, so that's an interesting, my CFO and I don't agree on this.
Okay.
In terms of non-financial metrics, he's almost always correct and I'm almost always wrong, but his view is that we need non-financial metrics that are tailored to the industry. And my view is that something like the WEF IBC non-financial metrics can be used across industries, and you maybe just delete a couple if they're not relevant for your sector. So time will tell. It doesn't really matter which one of us is right, but we do got to get beyond reporting just a P&L, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement.
Well, I actually think you're both right in that there are some of the metrics that cross. I mean, there are many metrics that can apply to any company, and that's actually really valuable. Every company reports revenues, for example, even though your revenues would be very different than the revenues of a SaaS company, for example, but you still both have revenues. But I think at the end of the day, the investors are probably not comparing your revenues to the SaaS company. They're comparing your revenues to somebody else. So I actually think you're both right. But if you think about that sort of comparison, well, let's talk about the metrics for a minute. And I think there's a lot of momentum between the WEF and IRC and SASB and IFRS and so on, that we will see this sort of growth in disclosure, growth in comparisons, growth in ability to actually have those conversations with companies. The one thing that people worry about is, what about the companies that aren't public? What about the people who are selling the dirty asset to the weaker hands, the people who don't care? And in other words, this sort of, not tension, but sometimes contradiction between actual decarbonization of the planet and cleaning up, my own portfolio or my own balance sheet. So how do you think about getting this beyond the people who are trying to be leaders to much more broadly? Is that just the governments, or what else can we do there?
No, I think, well, first of all, it's great. The train has definitely left the station. And we're within quarters now, not years, of seeing some standardized reporting of non-financial metrics. And I think it's really fantastic that we're mobilizing. Second thing is we've got to not let perfect get in the way of good. And imagine if we could get all public companies reporting on their ESG performance, what an achievement that would be. Thirdly, actually, and you well know this, private companies that are off the radar tend to run to higher standards in terms of their long-term commitments and long-term performance. So it's really a minority of, you used the word, not me, but dirty players. Let's not, that's not our first focus. Let's shift the masses, and then we'll worry about the laggards. One way or another, they'll get put out of business, either through consumer choices or their customers, whoever their customers are, one way or another, they'll get put out of business. And then the final point is an area which I think is cause for concern, which is the bulk of the economy that we're dealing with in most countries is not the top 100 or top 250 companies. It's the SMEs. And I can tell you, it's hard to navigate these non-financial metrics. It's hard for an SME to know where to start, even with the best will in the world. How do I make a net zero commitment if I'm Jones the butcher, or if I'm running a small retail operation or a small service company? What does it mean to be net zero? What does it mean to reduce my carbon footprint? And so there's work being done in the lead up to COP to create toolkits for SMEs to be able to take simple, practical steps to decarbonize their business, as just one example. So there's a few thoughts. It's good news overall. Let's get the public companies sorted out. Don't worry too much about the odd malevolent. And who might really need our help are the SMEs who struggle to know where to start in this space.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice, and it is exciting how much progress is underway. So that's terrific. So I think one of the there have been a few silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, one is maybe we've all been sitting in front of our screens, getting a lot of work done on some of these issues. But another one I think has been the increased understanding of the interconnectedness of people around the world, and whether we liked it or not, no country could keep the virus out. No country should be thinking they can keep emissions out. And the need to sort of be connected in that way and care for others is very fundamental to what you do. So do you think this recognition will outlast the pandemic, or are we going to forget this lesson and go back to our old ways as soon as we can get on the next airplane?
Well, it's a bit of both, isn't it? I think during the pandemic, we've all realized that what we value most ultimately is family, friends, freedom, good health, open spaces, clean air has come up. And I don't think people are going to forget easily what they've experienced. And we've got lots of data that shows a rise in conscious consumption. People are making sustainable brand choices in the sectors that we compete in at an elevated level that's showing no sign of abating as countries come out of COVID. Just a couple of examples from Unilever's business that will maybe set the tone. Our home care business, which is all the cleaning products and the laundry detergents, is basically selling petrochemicals in bottles. And we've made the commitment that by 2030, we'll be completely out of fossil fuels to supply the materials that we make these products from. And that all the carbon will not come from fossil fuels, but will come from a different carbon rainbow: green carbon from nature, blue carbon from the oceans, purple carbon from direct air capture, gray carbon from recycled material. And we've got a few examples. We've got a dishwashing liquid in South America that's made from sugar cane. That's where the carbon comes from. Not only is it cheaper, not only is it more sustainable, it actually performs better. It's more gentle in the hands. We've got an amazing new product we just launched in China, which is an Omo Laundry Capsule, where the chemistries inside it come from CO2 recovered from a Chinese steelmaking plant. And what we're discovering is as soon as we launch these things, we can't keep up with demand. The consumers, absolutely stripping the shelves for them. Now, I think that's symptomatic of a number of lasting effects that we'll see from COVID-19. We'll see this conscious consumption persisting, I hope. We think, obviously, e-everything, we're not all going to go back to, we're not going to unlearn the ways that we shop, pay, connect digitally. There's a heightened obsession with health and well-being. We see that in many of our businesses. And I don't think many of us will go back to full-time in the office. Some titans of industry are mandating that, but I think the middle ground seems to be some hybrid way of working. And so I think there's going to be lots of positive echoes from COVID. But I want to maybe finish this section, Sarah, by saying we are lucky to sit in countries and economies and societies that are emerging from COVID, whether we're in New York, London, some of the other major centers in the world. Most of the world is still in the thick of it. And what's happening right now in South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, and I fear for Africa, is absolutely ghastly. It's awful. It's like a war zone right now. And until the world is vaccinated, none of us can, it seems, as you said, vaccination is the only path out. And until the world is vaccinated, none of us should assume that this scourge has passed.
No, it's absolutely we have to remember how terrible it is when it first hit one of our cities, how shocking it was, and it's now obviously reverberating around the world. And one of the worries is that there'll be, you mentioned COP26, for example, how we can get people to, we don't want to have a situation where the developed world people who have been vaccinated can all get together, but the developing world gets left out, of a conversation, let alone of vaccines and let alone of development. So how we navigate that, I think, is critical. How are you thinking about navigating that within your own company, which of course spans almost every country in the world?
Yeah, well, we are, first of all, we're just constantly reminding ourselves that we're living in an asymmetric, volatile, and unjust world. The people who have been most impacted by COVID unfavorably are groups that typically do suffer. So we know that women have been adversely impacted just as we're starting to achieve some level of gender parity. It's a huge setback for women who still do the majority of unpaid caring work in the world. It's been a huge setback for minority ethnic groups in country after country. We're recording this, Sarah, on the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and we've gone backwards on that regard. The LGBTQI plus community has seen increases in abuse and attacks, and it's not been easy for people with disabilities. So first, we remind ourselves of that fact. Secondly, I think business has a huge responsibility to care for our employees. I must say, I think we will all be judged for many years to come on the actions that we took, on how we did or did not care for our employees and our communities. And I won't continue bragging, but we've got a lot to be proud of in that. But maybe the most important thing is we're really advocating for vaccines. We want all of our people to get themselves vaccinated. Vaccine hesitancy is a real risk to the speed at which the world comes out of this. It's very unevenly distributed, that vaccine hesitancy. It's strong in some developed markets, but it's very strong in some developing markets like Russia, where people are highly hesitant to get vaccinated. So for the little bit that we can do, we are looking after our people, and we're encouraging everyone to get vaccinated.
Well, I think that is a good way for us to wrap this up and think about the bigger picture of sort of where we're going and what might come next, and to thank you and Unilever for your leadership, because you may have a long way to go still. You may still need to accomplish a lot, but I think it is fair to say that I have been in hundreds of conversations where Unilever is pointed to as a leader in sustainability and as a beacon for others. So we appreciate that. We appreciate your thinking on this and the tie to the business case and the long-term value creation, because that's what really makes it work. I love that you said, Unilever is not an NGO, and you certainly are not, and you've proved that for your shareholders. So thank you for that. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with as we wrap this?
Well, as my mum taught me to say, thank you, Sarah, for having me. We've discussed some important subjects this afternoon, and I thank you for the work that you're doing at FCLT Global. I think there is a strong overlap between long-term thinking, between responsible and sustainable business, between purpose, and ultimately, therefore, between superior financial performance and better returns. And so the work that the thought leadership that FCLT Global is bringing will help us all get over the misperceptions and false dichotomies that somehow or other there's a cost to doing business the right way. So keep that up, and very proud to be part of the FCLT Global team and community. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Going Long with FCLT Global. Be sure to hit subscribe to get new episodes every other Monday. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org.